Welcome, everyone. This is Sharon Terry. I'm President and CEO of Genetic Alliance, which I think most of you know is a network of about 10,000 organizations dedicated to health overall. We're really happy to be able to host this webinar series throughout the entire year, once a month. We're delighted at the topic this year, what about privacy in progress in whole genome sequencing? We're really happy that we're going to kick off the series with Kate, who is going to discuss with us Part A of the report. Just to give everybody sort of an overview, which I'll only take a second for, of the webinar series, essentially will happen throughout the year, one a month, and you can see all of the topics on Genetic Alliance's website. They dive very deeply into the report, and then toward the end of the year, we will in fact take up some of the issues starting in October that have arisen throughout this year's discussions. So we ask you to contribute your ideas to what we might be presenting as we go. The other just introductory comments that I will make are that what we'll be doing today is hearing from Kate for about 30 minutes. During that time, you are welcome to ask questions. And we're going to have you do that by writing in the little box on the webinar panel your question. Just type it in there, and we'll be taking care of collating all those questions for Kate. This is an extraordinary webinar and webinar series in the sense that there are about 400 individuals registered for this, and so we can't open the lines because it would be absolute chaos. But we are going to try to take care of as many questions as we can. We're beyond this webinar going to also try to take care of questions that were not answered, although to be quite frank, we don't yet have the funding to do that kind of staffing, and so we're looking for some co-sponsors who could help us with that staffing or that funding. So without further ado, because I want to give the bulk of this time to the topic, Kate is the Associate Director at the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. She was the Associate Director for this report called Privacy in Progress in Whole Genome Sequencing. Again, she's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have another 30 minutes or so for questions, but feel free to put those questions in as we go. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Kate.
Hi. Thank you for the introduction, Sharon. Let me just show my screen to everyone so we can all look at my slides. I think we should be all set now. So I just wanted to start by saying how excited we all are here at the Commission about this entire webinar series. We'll try to kick off this discussion with a thorough introduction to the report, both today and next month with my colleague Elizabeth Pike. And then we will certainly be dialing in with much interest for the remainder of the year. There are some really great speakers lined up, and we all look forward to the insights and ideas I have no doubt that they will share with us. I also want to apologize for the sound of my voice. I have a bad cold, so if there's some long dramatic pause, I'm probably just blowing my nose. So sorry about that. So as a quick overview of what I'm going to try to cover today, I want to talk a bit about the Commission and its work generally to give you some insight to the perspective from which the members approach their topic. I'm then going to talk a little bit about the process behind the Commission's most recent report, Privacy in Progress in Whole Genome Sequencing, and the public meetings, agency input, and public feedback that really went into it. Last, I'm going to give us an overview of the report itself, talking about its scope, key findings, and its chapters. The Commission focused its recommendations on 5 areas in particular, and I'll go through them generally today. And then next month, my colleague Elizabeth Pike is actually going to take a deeper dive into the Commission's recommendation chapter for you all. So President Obama created his Bioethics Commission in November 2009, and it was to advise him on bioethical issues that may emerge as a consequence of advances in biomedicine and related areas of science and technology. The Commission in particular focuses its work on potential impacts and advances in research, healthcare delivery, or any area of science and technology. And up on the screen is the executive order which established us. The Commission does try to get out and about. It holds meetings 4 times a year across the country to engage in public deliberation. And on your screen are all the places that we've held meetings in the past. It invites planned speakers and also welcomes public comment at all of these places. I personally have been working hard at planning the Commission's Hawaii meeting. The Government Travel Department is going to get back to me on that one soon. These are our members. We are chaired by Amy Gutman, who is also the president of the University of Pennsylvania. Our vice chair is Jim Wagner, the president of Emory. The Commission is allowed 13 members, and we really have a diverse assortment. We have several government representatives, including Nelson Michael, who is the director of the Military HIV Research Program at Walter Reed, and Christine Grady, the chief of the Department of Bioethics at the NIH. We also have many academics who focus on privacy, law, medicine, theology, and research. There's also a staff. The staff are led by Lisa M. Lee, who came to us from her job as the Chief Science Officer in the Office of Surveillance, Epidemiology, and Laboratory Sciences at CDC. These on your screen are the staff in particular who worked on the genomics report, and as you can see, they also have a pretty diverse background, scientists, PhDs, and lawyers. The Commission has put out 4 reports today, the first being focused on the ethics of synthetic biology and emerging technologies. The second 2 reports that you see here stemmed from the same assignment from the President, charging the Commission to conduct a thorough fact-finding investigation into the public health services research in Guatemala in the 1940s. And then the one to the right of that, moral science, is a thorough review of current research participant protections. Privacy and Progress in Whole Genome Sequencing, the focus of this webinar, came out in October 2013. It was the first report that the Commission put out on a topic of its own choosing. The previous ones had been assigned from the President. The Commission will next put out a report on pediatric medical countermeasures, and then we'll take up deliberations on the topic of incidental findings. So the Commission put out the genomics report, but it certainly didn't do it without a lot of public input. As I discussed, the Commission holds public meetings, and it held 4 public meetings on the genomics report in Washington, D.C. and San Francisco on the topic, and heard from many important players in the field, including some of the same speakers who are part of this webinar series that I highlighted for you here on my screen. Speakers generally addressed issues of privacy, consent, data security, access, views from the patient advocacy community, and relevant philosophical topics. The Commission also solicited all 18 Common Rule agencies to survey whether they collect, maintain, or use human genetic information and how they provide oversight or regulation of such work. The Commission also asked them if they had formally advocated the need for statutory changes due to the advent of inexpensive and readily available genome sequencing, or whether the agency anticipated proposing new policies or programs. This is a table from the report that displays the results of all of that research. The Commission found that 6 agencies currently sponsor genetic and/or genomic studies, including the Department of Homeland Security, Defense, Justice, Health and Human Services, the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Transportation. And as an example of the type of work that they do, the Department of Defense collects genomic data for their DNA dog tag program, which has taken mandatory samples from every member of the armed forces since 1991, actually. They stated that DNA is only extracted if needed to identify remains, and that specimens cannot be used for any other purpose unless approved by the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs. DoD plans to expand their use of whole genome sequencing for forensic applications in the future. We got some really interesting data back from all of these, and I just want to emphasize that everyone at the Commission is extremely grateful for the time and effort we know went into gathering this information. The Commission also put out a request for information to the public, soliciting comment on the ethical issues raised by the ready availability of large-scale human genome sequence data with regard to privacy and data access and the balancing of individual and societal interests. We received many comments from a broad range of responders. Topics of focus sort of across the comments included privacy, security, informed consent, access, return of results, ownership rights, and some interest in particular populations. A particularly fun comment for us was one that we got from more than 200 undergraduate students from 2 genetics classes at North Dakota State University who sent in summaries of their class discussions regarding genetics and ethics and actually all signed the letters. So we encourage that in the future if any of you have students that might be interested in that type of thing. So why did the Commission choose whole genome sequencing as its first self-selected report? One of the reasons is that the state of technology is particularly ripe for ethical debate. As the cost of sequencing drops, sequencing your entire genome might become less expensive in the future than running a few discrete genetic tests. There is also enormous potential for public benefit that is reliant on large numbers of individuals sharing their genomic data for research purposes. Information that accompanies the data, the better. But then how do you secure that data? Who should have access to them? And what should constitute misuse of that data? These are all critical questions that accompany large genomic data sets. We also, of course, have the need to respect persons as individuals, and it is these individuals that are shouldering the privacy risk. And for them, perhaps, the more health and demographic information that accompanies their data, the more likely it is to become identifiable, if they didn't intend for that to be the case. People generally seem to feel that genomic information has sort of a different ethical value than, say, an act regarding where we came from, who we are today, and what might happen to us in the future. So this is a critical ethical reconciliation that needs to happen between public benefit and respect for persons, which the Commission was very interested in. And making this all the more complicated, we don't even know exactly what we're reconciling yet, right? Because what individuals are actually risking might become public because the amount of information that we can derive from one's genome just continues to grow. So the Commission decided to take up this fascinating topic. The hope for the report was that all current genetic and genomic research could be measured against the principles and recommendations that it included. The Commission intended the scope to be flexible enough to accommodate future advances in large-scale sequencing and analysis. Also, the Commission did recognize that ethical obligations often reach beyond that which is legally enforceable. So it offered recommendations on both exactly what ought to be done, but also what legally must be done. The Commission really came up with 3 key findings that informed both its deliberations and its recommendations. The first is that current U.S. law and regulation does not really fully protect individuals from the risks associated with sharing their genomic data. The second, however, is that realizing the promise of whole genome sequencing really requires widespread sharing of data and medical information to promote progress. So the last is that if people are expected to share their genomic data to promote this progress and to respect them as people, laws, regulations, and policies really have to respect and protect this individual privacy. Chapter 1 of the Commission's report, therefore, focused on the ethical principles that the Commission felt apply to whole genome sequencing and how these principles inform, in particular, individual privacy. The report itself uses the word, privacy can be used in lots of different ways, but the report really uses the word privacy to mean sort of a state of affairs by virtue of which the accessibility of personal information or property is somehow limited or restricted The report focuses on decisional privacy, meaning who is permitted to decide whether genomic data are shared, as well as informational privacy, meaning whether such data will be shared in confidence, securely, or be de-identified to the extent possible. Because whole genome sequencing begins by taking an example, sorry, now I have everything for everyone, thanks. Because whole genome sequencing begins by taking a sample from an individual person, the Commission began its analysis with the Belmont Report principle of respect for persons. But since biomedical science has evolved so significantly since the Belmont Report's creation, the Commission also applied 5 additional ethical principles taken from its Synthetic Biology and Emerging Technologies report. Respect for persons is where we started, and it's straight from Belmont, and it requires one to give great, quote, weight to autonomous persons' considered opinions and choices while refraining from obstructing their actions unless they are clearly detrimental to others, end quote. Public beneficence from the Commission's SynBio report asks us to pursue and secure public benefits and minimize personal and public harm. It really encompasses society's duty to promote activities that have great potential to improve the public's well-being. Intellectual freedom allows scientists the right to use their creative abilities to advance science and the public good, but intellectual responsibility, its corollary, requires scientists to adhere to the ideals of research, avoid harm to others, and abide by all applicable policies, rules, and regulations. Responsible stewardship is a duty to proceed prudently in promoting scientific advancement and emerging technologies, and to act in ways that demonstrate concern for all those affected, particularly those who cannot represent themselves. Justice and fairness is a commitment to ensuring that unavoidable burdens of technological advances do not fall disproportionately on any individual or group, and that benefits are distributed widely. And last, through democratic deliberation, we must continue to engage the public and foster dialogue among the scientific community, policymakers, and persons concerned with the issues raised by scientific progress. Chapter 2 of the Commission's report focused on the policy and governance of whole genome sequencing and asked in particular what kinds of privacy protections are currently in place to protect individuals. GINA, for example, is really focused as an anti-discrimination law. It does not provide comprehensive privacy protections. It has several limitations on its discrimination protections, including that it only covers employers and health insurers, and so it doesn't protect in other areas such as life insurance, for example. HIPAA and the common rule protections turn on the identifiability of data, as you all know, meaning that if genomic data is not considered protected health information or readily identifiable, there may be no comprehensive federal privacy protection. And last, there are no overarching federal guidelines for privacy in commercial genetic testing. It was from this type of information that the Commission really concluded that U.S. governance and oversight of genetic and genomic data doesn't protect individuals as well as they could from the risks associated with sharing their genomic data, and that further protections are really warranted. What the Commission was then thinking about what shape these further protections could take, it really focused its report on 3 facets of privacy and confidentiality, which are really important no matter whether the data is considered protected health information or identifiable or even de-identified. The first level is the individual, which requires fostering ethical behavioral norms for researchers and clinicians with any access to genomic data. Second, information technology programs, as I know you'll be discussing later on in this webinar series, really should keep patient and participant data secure to be only accessed and used in ways that are consistent with participant consent. And third, policy-level protections, which require that systems be in place to provide clear institution-level expectations of training and preparation to be able to handle genomic data information to be able to ensure an atmosphere of trust and an expectation of security, and also provide recourse should other protections fail. Also, I want to let you guys know that I really encourage you to type in your questions as they occur. And I think that they're going to work to compile everything, and then I'll take as many as I can at the end of my presentation. But I'm sure that if everyone tries to type in all their questions at the end, we won't be able to get to everything. So please feel free to do that as I go along. So finally, Chapter 3 of the report, which is really the meat of the report. It takes ethical principles elaborated on in Chapter 1 and then the regulatory and policy information set forth in Chapter 2 and comes up with 5 main areas that the Commission believes can be improved to ensure that laws, regulations, and policies honor public beneficence, respect for persons, and all the other pertinent ethical principles. So on your screen now are the 5 areas for ethical analysis in which the Commission focused their recommendations. They include strong baseline protections while promoting data access and sharing, data security and access to databases, informed consent, facilitating progress, and public benefit. So next month, at the next webinar, Elizabeth Pike is going to go through these recommendations in much more detail for you. But today I just wanted to highlight some of the main points. The first set of recommendations focusing on strong baseline protections while promoting data access and sharing focus on policies that apply to handlers of genomic data. I just want to forewarn you that all of these slides of the recommendations can be highlight recommendations as opposed to the full recommendations themselves. But our report and all of the full recommendations are available on our website at www.bioethics.gov. So these recommendations in particular focus on privacy protections, guarding against unauthorized access to and illegitimate use of whole genome sequence data and information, but still allow authorized use to advance individual as well as public health. The Commission also, as a general principle, recognized that treating like data alike is crucial to ensuring consistent protections, meaning that genomic data should be treated the same no matter who collects it and no matter where they collect it. That means, whether your clinician collects it in the clinic, whether your researcher collects it in a freestanding facility, or whether it's collected on the street. States should enact regulations most relevant to their constituents, obviously. However, bringing protections to a minimal standard on the federal level would provide just and fair protections regardless of where one happens to reside. So the Commission really recommended that experts in federal law, state law, policy, and privacy in genomics be brought together to engage further democratic deliberation regarding acceptable access to and permissible use of genomic data to apply across state lines. In the realm of data security and then access to databases, recognize that data privacy, of course, requires data security, and data security requires ethical responsibility and accountability from all those who handle our whole genome sequence data. As we all know, genomic data is uniquely identifiable, meaning it belongs to only one person in the universe. It should be stripped of traditional identifiers whenever possible to prevent it from being readily identifiable, but as we all know, the protections of de-identified data are rapidly being chipped away. This is why the Commission focused its recommendations not on the dichotomy of identifiable or de-identified data, but rather on data security, data access, and data use. The Commission recommended that there must be policies dictating ethical access to and use of genomic data, and that then those who work with the genomic data must follow these guidelines and not intentionally, recklessly, or negligently access or misuse that data. In its third area of focus, the Commission recognized that a well-developed, understandable, informed consent process is essential to ethical clinical care as well as research. It recommended that consent processes should ascertain participant or patient preferences when the genomic sample is first obtained. Respect for persons requires fully informed consent at the outset of diagnostic testing or research, and when possible, individuals should be given the option to withhold their data for certain types of future research. Patients and participants really must understand what whole genome sequencing is, the potential risks that are uniquely associated with it, how their future data will be analyzed, stored, and potentially shared, the types of results the patient or participant can expect to receive back, and the likelihood that the implications of some of these results might currently be unknown, but could be discovered in the future. In particular, the consent process the Commission found should discuss incidental findings and whether those findings will be communicated, the scope of those communicated findings, and to whom the findings will be communicated. The fourth area that the Commission focused on was facilitating progress in whole genome sequencing, encouraging exchange of information, and maintaining data protection. The ethical principle of respect for persons really implies not only respecting individual privacy, but also the corollary is respecting research participants as autonomous people who might choose to share their own data, which is something that we learned a lot about in our meetings. Public beneficence, in turn, is advanced by giving researchers access to lots of data from which they can then work to advance healthcare for us all. While the Commission supports the intellectual freedom this access will encourage, clinicians and researchers must also act responsibly to earn public trust for the research enterprise and protect its participants. And the last area of focus for the Commission's recommendations was that of public benefit. As you know, thousands of citizens have participated in genomic research, and all citizens through taxes really help support government investment in this technology. And therefore, the Commission felt strongly that all citizens should have the opportunity to benefit from medical advances. This really requires researchers also ensuring that their participants reflect the diversity of our population so that research findings can be translated widely into clinical care. So that is the end of the presentation part of this webinar. My goal was a sort of a high-level executive summary type overview of the Commission's full report and process before I know you all spend the rest of the year really focusing in and diving deep on the recommendations. I know there's been a lot of time devoted to thinking about all of this information in the forthcoming sessions, but at this point, I'd be happy to take any questions or any comments that people would like to share.
Great. Thanks so much, Kate. That is Sorry, am I being, okay, somebody here was indicating I'm not being heard, but I think I am. That was a fabulous overview. Thank you very much. And we did get a number of questions that we're going to start to ask you, and we are grouping those together so that they make sense. The first one I think is a very basic one that would be great for you to start out with, and the individual asks, why are we creating separate rules for genetic information? Genetic information is part of the entirety of an individual's health information, like all medical data. Are we promoting genetic exceptionalism here?
Thank you, Sharon. I think that that's a really good question. And no, the Commission was not intending to promote genetic exceptionalism. However, I do think that there are definitely some differences between your whole genome versus, for example, an X-ray or a blood test for something specific. And, you know, some of those really unique differences that come to mind and that the Commission talked about in the report are, for example, that it's unique to only you. If somebody sees, you know, an X-ray of my femur, there can be no way for them to seek me out and particular out of everyone and know what's wrong with my bones. So it's unique only to you. Also, it has the potential to give lots of information potentially about blood relatives. You know, if I consent to a genomic sequence, it could give information about my mother or my daughter or my sister in a way that sort of an individual medical test often does not. And I think the last point really is that we're still not sure. We're learning so much new every day about what the genome can tell us. We don't know everything that the genome can tell us. So, you know, if I consent to getting my whole genome sequence today because I'm comfortable with the, you know, 2,000 markers that we now know how they relate to diagnosis of disease, and I say, yeah, that sounds fine to me. I don't know what I might be consenting to in the future because maybe they'll find 2,000 new things. And so I think that those types of things is really what makes genomics unique and really why the Commission was particularly interested.
Super, thank you. The next set of questions are a number of questions on how you can go about having a comprehensive session, essentially asking questions like, how are you going to see privacy protections equalized across the common rule organizations? What's the role of the state and the federal entities? How can we set guidelines for biomedical as well as other uses like law enforcement? So I think you can anticipate there's quite a few questions. I'm just summarizing a couple here, you know, GINA and HIPAA. So talk a little bit about sort of your vision for what we can do in a comprehensive way, or do we have to have a more siloed or granular approach?
So, yeah, I think that that's a really good question, and I think the answer is probably that it doesn't have to be an either-or. You know, it really doesn't have to be a siloed approach, and it doesn't only have to be a comprehensive approach. I think that the Commission really recommended things on both fronts. And as far as the comprehensive approach goes, the Commission sort of, so it has this recommendation 1.2, and if I'm really fancy, no, I can't go back. And the recommendation 1.2 really urges the federal and the state governments to ensure a consistent floor of privacy protection covering whole genome sequence data regardless of how they were obtained. And the Commission recommends and would really look forward to sort of experts in federal law, state law, policy, and privacy be brought together to engage in further democratic deliberation to really talk about how this can be done on the policy level. The Commission in particular was interested in suggested requirements to ensure a floor of protection of whole genome sequence data and data sharing over all of the states, and the practical steps necessary to accomplish this goal, such as federal, state, or non-regulatory interventions. So that's sort of one idea at the federal and state level, is to get people to sort of sit down and talk about what the baseline, what the floor should be. And then, of course, states such as, California, who I know is debating this a lot now, can go above and beyond that with extra protections for their constituents. But if we could really get this floor of baseline protections out, that would certainly, at the very least, prohibit unauthorized whole genome sequencing without the consent of the person from whom the sample came, then we would really be getting somewhere. When we're talking about sort of the common rule agencies and HIPAA and, the stuff that's already existing, as you know, those currently turn really on the identifiability of data. And, we have the ANPRM, which sort of talks a lot about that now, and so that might change a bit there. But also as data, if data becomes more readily identifiable in the future, then certainly common rule protections and HIPAA protections would then apply to that data. So, and then also the Commission focused on these 3 silos that I talked to us about. Sort of, even if you have these comprehensive protections, you can also have protections at smaller levels. And the first level is really protections that individuals can offer, individuals who are working with whole genome sequence data. And these individuals really need to sort of embody and learn and act upon norms for researchers and clinicians with access. And then sort of another silo that the Commission talked a lot about is IT systems and how, I remember Tanya Sweeney told us at one of our meetings, and it's very vivid to me. She says, most people, and I'm sure she'll talk about it more later, but she said most people assume that when you make something electronic, you're making it less safe. And of course, that's not necessarily the case, because new technologies include things such as watermarks. You can see who accessed data. You can see how they accessed it, how long they saw it. And so information technology systems is another place where we can really focus our efforts, to sort of enforce the ethical ideals and the things that we're teaching people. And then the third is, policy-level protections from institutions. I know we have a lot of university geneticists and genetic counselors calling in, and really having these different places institute their own best practices. That if all of that happened, that would certainly be that would really advance the state of the ethics in genomics. So those are just some ideas that the Commission came up with.
Terrific. And one question that kind of follows on that, and this one, Kate, is really going to ask for you to speculate more than you might even be comfortable doing, is so for the individual navigating all these systems, because they're coming in and out of, military to VA to civilian medicine to maybe forensic applications, how will this be communicated to the public so they understand where they are in the system and why one set of rules might apply and then another in another instance?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Don't worry, I don't speculate. I'm a lawyer. That's like the one thing I learned in law school. But I don't think we need to entirely speculate, because I think what the Commission really focused on as being so important is informed consent. And if all whole genome, and this is an ethical ideal, but if all whole genome sequencing started with a truly informed consent that told people what was happening, that this wasn't just another blood test, and it told people what type of information was going to be produced, and it told people what the risks of that type of information were, and it told people what uses that data could be used for. If people really understood what was going on, then that would really, then they wouldn't have to navigate post hoc, right? They would decide whether that was a world that they wanted to enter into in the first place. So I really think that this emphasis on consent was an integral portion of the Commission's regulations, the Commission's recommendations. And, the Commission actually continues to work on these ideas and actually has been in contact with the Office of OHRP, Human Subject Protections, talking with them about how we can really get some, how they can really get some guidances out there for people who are trying to get both patients and participants to consent to whole genome sequencing, and what types of information they really need for that consent to be informed.
Super. There's a whole series of questions that kind of roll off what you just said, and they are really around the way we have viewed consent. And I'm going to ask a couple of them together, and you can feel free to parse them separately or to leave them together. And they are that we usually think about trying to protect, that sometimes and actually very often includes stripping the identifiers, whether it's the HIPAA identifiers or others, in the course of research and even in clinical translational science. What about other models? So what about models where the consent follows the sample? What about models, someone brought up George Church and how he advocates for just completely open testing. What about the value of samples and data when they have been stripped, and can they be reconnected with longitudinal data? How did the Commission look at that whole area in the sense that we certainly do want to provide the highest protections and at the same time the best science? And I know that was a real core concept throughout the report, but if you could say a little more about that and maybe other models, that would be terrific.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, the current governance structure really does seem to turn on identifiability of data, but as your questioner pointed out, there are certainly other approaches. If you're really talking about consent as sort of the integral starting point, as I think you mentioned, there are some ways to sort of metadata tags, so you can actually, the type of consent that the person agreed to will actually follow the data in the future, including, theoretically data research that they did not want to be a part of. For example, reproductive research was one of the examples that came up at the meetings. So there are sort of different avenues of going about this. The Commission, however, really sort of focused on the integral principles behind what would sort of motivate those different avenues that you could go down. And, time and time again, they sort of emphasize the importance of treating like data alike, meaning that, no matter who took it or where they took it, whether it's my clinician that, medical waste in the clinic versus if I literally go into a research study and say, yes, please take my whole genome and use it for XYZ research, versus, my Starbucks cup that I left, no promotion intended, that I left out on the street corner. That's what's really important, is that all of these types of data get the same type of protection. And that way, whether they are de-identified now but become re-identified later, or whether they have metadata tags, or no matter how we play with them while we're still sort of trying to make the system as perfect as possible, we'll still respect the people as persons who originally contributed that data while we try to benefit, while the whole public tries to benefit from them. So I think that there are a lot of different ideas of ways to do that, and I think people will talk about it later in this webinar series of some of the brilliant ideas I'm sure that they have. But the Commission really focused on the basic principle that gets us there first.
And in the consideration of those basic principles, what value did the Commission place on returning information, results, data, general information, specific information back to individuals, and the complexity of doing that if the data samples are severed from the person?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So it's about the access to information if the data is severed from the person. Logistically, I'm sure that there's a lot to be said about that. As far as the value, the Commission really focused on the value of privacy, and I think that there are a lot of really, really critical different avenues that we could talk about. The one that the Commission really wanted to focus on, though, is sort of access to sort of the second step after privacy. It's once you have privacy, and then maybe people sort of want to go around that and get more access to their data. And the Commission really started with the sort of more fundamental concept of, if you don't want other people to have access to your data, how do you protect that? And then if we're talking about returning data, I think that that is a really critical and interesting question, and certainly the Commission talked about that a bit when it was talking about consent, as well as sort of some of the incidental findings that come back when you do consent, and sort of that you really need to talk to the patient or participant about what will be communicated and the scope of communicated findings. And that way, the patient or participant knows ahead of time that, for example, that the data will be severed from any identifying information, and that they won't be able to get any future information back from the researcher. And so it really all comes back to that fundamental principle of consent. However, I mean, agrees with the questioner that incidental findings is an incredibly interesting avenue, and that's why they've chosen to take that up as their next topic.
Super. And why did the Commission decide to take on the topic of privacy as the primary way into this whole series of questions, rather than ownership or control from the point of view of the individual?
So, I mean, once again, I think that goes back to just the fact that there are really a lot of different, very interesting questions that one can take up with whole genome sequencing. But the Commission chose privacy because the Commission felt like that was extremely fundamental to this new technology, because, of its capacity to tell us so much information about oneself and one's relatives. And so it just really seemed like privacy and identifiability was really on sort of the cutting edge for genomics. And I honestly think we've seen that, in fact, it was on the cutting edge for genomics. And so, it was just a choice that the Commission made, and so that's why they went with privacy.
Terrific, thanks. You're doing great, Kate. This is a real marathon. We still have quite a few questions. How about talking a little bit about what the Commission thought about family members' rights when an individual makes a decision to pursue whole genome sequencing?
Once again, I think family members' rights is a critical question. Certainly, it was one of the things that the Commission spoke about when they were talking about the importance of consent. And one of the reasons that it's so important is because it has this potential to implicate other family members. The Commission didn't specifically sort of go into it vis-a-vis the other family members, but just that it was sort of this very important part of the original consent, that the person realized at least what they were consenting to, and that it potentially might implicate their other family members.
Super. Could you also say something about misuse? The questioner is giving, for example, the example of Gina. How many times has Gina been challenged? While we're able to track the data use, can we respond to the misuse?
So I'm not a Gina expert, but my limited knowledge is that there hasn't been like myriad cases of discrimination brought. However, I think really what's important is that we really talk about sort of this baseline of protections So, because GINA sort of offers people protections, right, against discrimination, but it's not a privacy statute, right? It's sort of, once something happens, they'll say, well, you're not supposed to discriminate, but as some of the people that we interviewed for the report, and one of the people that appears right at the beginning of the report is that, discrimination is one of those things where people can say they don't discriminate, but, it's one of the things that there's not a lot of control over. And so what the Commission thought was really important was privacy in the first place, rather than sort of trying to fix things once they got out.
Great. Okay. Let's see, just trying to figure out where we should go right now. How about, so did the report come down in a specific way around how to de-identify genetic information with some standard that everybody should follow?
No, it did not.
That was an easy one.
Yeah.
Could you please say something more about the difference between decisional privacy and informational privacy adopted by the report?
Sure. So decisional privacy versus informational privacy. So decisional privacy really focuses on sort of who's going to have access, who's going to have the ability to sort of dictate what type of access and use people are going to have to your whole genome sequence data. So decisional privacy is really about consent, right? It's about knowing what's happening and how it's going to be used again in the future and being part of that decision. Sort of like we were talking about before, how can we get participants and patients sort of more actively involved in their data? How can what they decide to do, how can that follow the data in the future? And informational privacy is sort of a step after decisional privacy. So, if I consent that my whole genome sequence data can be accessed for, Huntington's disease research, then I get informational privacy if my data is only accessed for that purpose. So the informational privacy is then about protecting the information in ways that I consented to. Hopefully that clarifies it a little bit.
Great, thank you. Next set of questions on informed consent in general, and I'm going to sort of bucket these in the sense of saying a lot is being hung on informed consent. Our medical system and our regs and rules have for a long time used informed consent as the kind of primary way that we interact around information in the medical context and in the research context. If we think about other ways of looking at this, for example, fair information practices, is this the best way to go, particularly since in a couple examples that a few of the questioners have given for are examples like we may be sequencing everybody at birth soon, and we don't know what decisions that person might make. So here we have the instance where the parents might make decisions. We have other maybe technologies that reveal or don't reveal parts of the genome and what's discovered at different parts of the life course. That's sort of one set of considerations. If consenting individuals at different points in either difficult medical instances, on the way to surgery, in a clearly comfortable context when they're making a good decision by themselves. So there's a wide range when they're making these consents. What if the consent process wasn't a truly informed one, and there needs to be some way to alleviate that? Did the Commission look at other things to hang this all on than informed consent, and did it look at the limitations of informed consent when it's not truly informed?
So I think that's a really important question, and I'm glad that someone asked it. The question of what other things to hang on besides informed consent. I don't think the Commission intended to hang everything on informed consent. The point is to hang things on respect for persons and public beneficence. And from those principles of respect for persons, we got to consent. But that doesn't mean that consent is the only way to respect people, or even the best way in some circumstances, as you were talking about. I'm particularly brought up children and newborn screening because I think that that's really interesting from a legal perspective because, you know, I'm just going to give more questions, which probably wasn't your intent, but, you know, federal privacy laws sort of inconsistently define the age of consent. Some places it's 18, but some states allow consent of minors as young as 14. But even if we were able to get consent, you know, if one of the potential future risks of whole genome sequencing is that we don't know what will happen in the future or what the science will inform us of, you know, that's even more compounded by the lifetime of a child. And, you know, last, if someone consents to whole genome sequencing for a minor, by the time you know, and shares that data in certain ways or shares that data in a lot of ways, you know, by the time the minor reaches the age of consent at 18, the cat might be very much out of the bag. So I do think that the consent of minors is a really interesting place to go. But your other question, you know, what if consent is not informed? I mean, so in an emergency situation, so I guess I don't know enough about, you know, emergent whole genome sequencing and what specific circumstances those happen under, although I do think that, to be fair, a lot of whole genome sequencing is not happening in emergency situations. Maybe other things are happening in emergency situations, and then whole genome genomes are sequenced later as additional data. But, you know, as long as the fundamental principle of respect for persons is adhered to, I think that consent can definitely take a lot of different forms, as consent already does in the clinic, you know, with emergency consent, surrogacy consent. So I think in answer to your question, the really important thing is the ethical principle as opposed to exactly how it's being enacted in this particular circumstance.
Super. I'm going to try to get in 2 more questions in 3 minutes, Kate, and then somebody there needs to resuscitate you because this is quite a marathon. What about the international issues? Can rules and regs be harmonized worldwide, since more and more we're going to rely on international and cross-disciplinary collaborations in order to get to the complex and sort of metadata sets we're going to need?
I think that that's a really great question. Certainly, ethical principles should apply worldwide, and so to the extent that rules and regulations and policies can apply worldwide, that would be lovely. But I think that that's something that people are really going to have to talk more about and think more about in the future.
Super. And last question. So what other than incidental findings did you guys parking lot for further consideration? So we can see that you are going to take up incidental findings after your next report. Are there other things from this report that you thought, wow, this really deserves further consternation, further discussion, further recommendations?
Yeah, so in addition to incidental findings, there was a couple other things that the Commission did not necessarily commit to taking up itself, but is definitely committed to staying attuned to. And one of them is this further work that I mentioned with OHRP. I'm really working on, you know, putting, you know, money where our mouth is, and like what types of informed consent would really satisfy the Commission's recommendations. And, you know, sort of working with them as they sort of work to put out guidances on that type of information. And then another thing, as I also mentioned, having to do with recommendation 1.2 and a question that we received earlier is, that's my daughter. I think you're Oh, that's super professional, Kate.
We noticed that, and we protected your privacy by switching to our generic slide.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Although everybody can tell me how adorable she is, I can sense that access and use of a picture of my daughter.
Right.
But anyway, sorry. So to really quickly sum up, yes, the Commission is really looking forward to potentially working with people who are really experts in federal and state law, working towards sort of this baseline of federal protections.
Super. Thank you. So, Kate, we want to really thank you and the Commission for all this work. We're really looking forward to next week when we'll see hear the second part of this introduction. One of the questions that's come up, and I don't expect you to answer right now, but one that I think is a good one, is the participants in this webinar are certainly interested in being involved even in an ad hoc way, that there's certainly a richness here for stakeholders throughout the entire community, whether they're healthcare providers or patient and advocates or researchers or policymakers. And so one of the things we'll do with you is explore how might there be ad hoc ways for individuals and organizations to be involved so that the richness of this report has legs and that we really see a lot of these things moved into implementation.
Yeah, great. We are so excited that everyone is so excited.
Absolutely. Wonderful. So I want to close just by thanking everyone for hanging in there. We certainly appreciate everyone's participation and the enthusiasm of the community and look forward to seeing everybody next month. Thank you.